It's March the 1st, 1989, the first day of another autumn. Locals are going about their daily business, comfortable with the knowledge that they live in one of the safest and most scenic suburbs in Sydney, where crime is almost non-existent. Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill is an 82-year-old widow living alone in a neat little apartment on Mossman's main street. It's mid-afternoon when Mrs. Mitchell-Hill visits the local shopping centre, and by 4 o'clock she walks the short distance towards her home unit. She has every reason to feel safe and secure in her peaceful domain. From the opposite direction, an evil soul leaving the Mossman RSL Club spots Mrs. Mitchell-Hill walking towards him and becomes engulfed in rage. She's blissfully unaware as he calmly walks to his parked car, takes something from the boot, and follows her to the foyer of her apartment block. Mike Hagan was the inspector in charge of the North Region Homicide Squad.
And just as she got to the door, she was obviously attacked. A couple of boys were visiting some relatives in the block of home units, and they came out shortly after and found this lady lying on the concrete. There was blood, a fair amount of blood around her head, and there was a purse that seemed to be open, and they thought she'd fallen over.
Mrs. Mitchell-Hill dies later that night in hospital. Police discover her red purse containing a fair amount of cash is missing. One of the state's most experienced forensic pathologists, Dr. Joe DeFleu, conducts the post-mortem and expresses some major concerns.
The thing that really made me very worried was the fact that she had a number of injuries to the back of the head, including a laceration to the back of the scalp and a fracture which was in the midline. Now that's very uncommon in a fall. Because in a fall, invariably when you fall over backwards, you tend to turn your head at the same time in an attempt. It's a very basic reflex. If she had fallen over backwards, she would have had to fall over straight back without moving her head. This to me was a very strong indication that she may have been struck to the back of the head.
Detective Sergeant Dennis O'Toole joins the homicide investigation and visits the crime scene.
There was another aspect in relation to this attack, was that the victim's panties and pantyhose had been removed. However, there was no evidence whatsoever of any sexual assault. That was a little bit baffling to the investigators initially.
One of the problems we had was the people acting in good faith who resided in the block of home units thought that she'd fallen over initially, and after she'd gone, they washed down the crime scene. So that when we examined the crime scene several hours later, even though there was evidence of some blood in the concrete, the actual crime scene had been washed down.
Detectives are baffled. There are no witnesses, there's little or no forensic evidence, and there's no murder weapon. The brutal crime is committed just metres from Mossman's bustling main street and adjacent to what at the time was a busy construction site. At this stage, it's a brutal but isolated murder. With few clues, solving the murder of Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill is becoming a frustrating uphill battle. It's now May the 9th, 1989, and 84-years-old widow Lady Winfreda Ashton leaves the Mossman RSL Club following some luncheon bingo. She then walks to the shopping centre before heading to her nearby home. Lady Ashton is oblivious to what's lurking only metres behind her. As she reaches the driveway, she checks the letterbox. It's only a short walk to the front door of the security block of units. The killer is stalking another prey. She enters the bin room to dispose of some junk mail. The killer strikes with shocking venom, violently banging her head on the concrete floor. Her struggle for life is brief. When the homicide detectives arrive, They're horrified by the gruesome crime scene.
And she was lying in the bin room. She had a red raincoat on, and her legs were bare, which immediately we thought that there might be something going on here in terms of a sex-related crime. But in actual fact, we discovered that her pantyhose had been removed and had been used as a weapon to strangle her. And her purse was beside the body, and it looked like it had been interfered with and opened. And her walking stick and shoes were placed, seemed to be quite neatly at the foot of the body.
But again, as in the first attack, it was very frustrating for police that there were no witnesses. All persons living in the area had been canvassed, yet nobody actually saw anything that could assist the police in the identification of a possible offender.
News of this second murder sends the media swarming to the area.
The circumstances of the murders of Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill and Lady Winfreda Ashton are strikingly similar. The attacks occurred within weeks of each other in Mossman apartment blocks. Both women were in their 80s, both brutally bashed and robbed.
The latest victim is the widow of Sir William Ashton, one of Australia's most celebrated landscape artists.
A source of real concern.
Justice Barry O'Keefe was a senior barrister and mayor of Mossman at the time.
Well, the immediate reaction was disbelief. This sort of thing can't have happened in Mossman. It must be somebody from outside. It's got to be. One of us wouldn't be doing this.
The pressure on investigators to quickly solve the case is perfectly understandable. Who knows when or where the killer will strike again? Police begin a massive 4 square kilometre, 2,000 home canvass of the Mossman precinct, and they meticulously follow up every lead. Several witnesses gave police a description of a person they saw in the area, and an identikit was prepared.
That person, for want of a better word, would be described as possibly a druggie, unkept, untidy, with bad teeth, quite a good description. But unfortunately, I believe that it played a very big part in forming an opinion in people's minds that that's the type of person we were looking for as a murderer.
Dr. Rod Milton, Sydney's leading and most experienced forensic psychiatrist, is called in to prepare a psychological profile as to who the killer might be.
Probably someone who was employed, who lived locally, who had some peculiar relationship with significant women in his life previously that we wouldn't know about, and who might just possibly have had a military background. And generally, crimes of that level of violence are committed by people who are reasonably young.
The juvenile theory was brought up basically because of the time of day and because of the close proximity to each of the murder scenes to high schools.
With this in mind, Hagan and his team liaise closely with the principals, teachers and staff of the nearby high school. The police investigative sweep of the area embraces members of the Navy and Army stationed in the Mossman area. Enormous resources are utilised in the police probe. And then, a startling development. A month later, a neighbour checks Lady Ashton's letterbox to find her wallet inside. It's intact, minus some cash. Police locate the woman who found the wallet, discarded in Mossman's Ashton Park, ironically named in honour of Lady Ashton's late husband. A search of the park fails to discover any further clues, but the release of the identikit sparks a litany of sightings from the anxious community.
So what we had now was what we believed to be a stranger killing. Now, stranger killings are about 20% of murders for us to look at. They're the hardest to try and track down, they're the hardest to try and solve. So we had a tremendous problem in front of us with these 2 murders.
2 elderly Mossman widows have now been bashed to death within a 2-month period. The killings occur in broad daylight as each of the women makes their way home. There are no clues to the killer at either of the crime scenes, and the bodies are displayed in sexually degrading poses. police need to know if the same person is responsible for both brutal murders.
The interesting thing were they were about a kilometre apart. The only distinctive difference was that this lady was strangled and the first lady wasn't strangled. But there was excessive violence in both murders, and that there was money stolen out of the purse. So here we again have this motive of greed. And so we made the decision there to link the two murders, which was a very appropriate decision to make.
The elderly in the community are frightened. Authorities move to quell their fears, particularly around the local shopping centres.
So we had the rangers doing their extra patrols with instructions that I gave that in the event that they saw elderly people, females, they were to offer them assistance, either walk with them or give them a ride home. Interestingly, most of the elderly ladies at that stage wanted to be independent. They didn't go along with that. But I suppose it was a comfort to know that it was there if they wanted it.
Despite their best efforts, homicide investigators are baffled and frustrated at the lack of clues and forensic evidence. They receive hundreds of calls from the public naming potential suspects. Each is investigated. Some suspects even placed under surveillance, but all eventually discounted.
It's just after 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Wednesday, October the 18th. And 86-year-old widow Doris Cox is strolling leisurely along the footpath outside her neat little apartment in Spit Road, Mossman. On the other side of the road, the killer is visiting the post office. He spots Mrs. Cox and rushes across towards her. Dennis O'Toole recounts what happens next.
The victim walked along this stairway here, walked down onto the pathway, totally unaware that she was being followed by the killer. She reached a point here where she was grabbed from behind. The killer grabbed her hair and smashed her head into the brick wall here. It was a particularly brutal attack, a vicious assault, and she really had no chance.
Amazingly, Doris Cox survives and is taken to hospital with horrific injuries. It's first thought she'd fallen over, and again the scene is washed down. Police are called, but it's not until after 10 p.m. when doctors become suspicious. When Dennis O'Toole's informed the next morning, he rushes to the hospital in anticipation. Finally, an eyewitness.
However, when we attempted to press her on what had happened when she got home, she was unable to tell us anything about the actual attack or anything that had happened to her or how she'd actually ended up in hospital.
The investigators' anticipation quickly turns to dismay when they learn that their eyewitness, unfortunately, suffers from dementia.
And I picked up a mirror and I said, "Look, Doris, somebody did this to you," and showed her a reflection in the mirror. And her reply was, "That's not me." So it was one of extreme disappointment, and basically walked out of the hospital wondering what else can go wrong.
We appealed to the public after this attempted murder in October. What we did get out of this, which became part of our investigation, was that some witnesses cited a skateboard rider, a young male in late teens who was riding a skateboard down on the footpath outside this retirement village round about the time of the murder. So these witnesses supplied a sketch drawing, a penry was done, and it was released to the media. And for several weeks we endeavoured to find the skateboard rider.
Eventually, the skateboard theory is eliminated. However, the skateboard rider remains a suspect police are desperate to interview. But if the skateboard is ruled out as a weapon, what could it be? And how many more elderly women will suffer or die before the case is solved?
For the first time ever, you had not only a number of people being murdered, but they were being murdered at the time that a current police investigation was going on. So there was enormous pressure, both from the police service itself and, of course, the political pressure.
I can remember on several occasions I went to the Mossman area and walked the streets myself on my own trying to get into the mind of who might be doing this and trying to work out a scenario of how this killer was operating.
It seems that the killer is taunting them. Yes, he's been very lucky so far, but he is more cunning and bolder than either detective has encountered in their long and illustrious careers. There is still no clue on the blunt weapon used to crush the victims' skulls, and the killer has left no fingerprints or any other forensic evidence.
Lane Cove is another of Sydney's northern suburbs, about 10 kilometres from Mossman. 78-year-old Dorothy Benke feels safe as she struggles down the main road. The fellow who approaches her seems very nice and polite. Little does she know that he's carrying a deadly weapon.
He engaged her in a conversation, amazingly given the publicity that had been generated and the police warnings given, and actually got him to carry her shopping bags. At that moment, she invited him into her unit for a cup of tea. He declined the cup of tea, and at that stage, amazingly, decided he would not kill her.
Minutes after that encounter, retracing his steps back up the laneway towards the bustling main street of Lane Cove, he passes Margaret Frances Pard, an 85-year-old widow who's making her way home.
He turned, followed her down the laneway, where he brutally attacked her from behind.
In a single moment, the kindness displayed towards Mrs. Benke is replaced by a deep hatred and an uncontrollable urge to kill.
On the ground, he removed her underwear, her pantyhose, and then stole her purse.
Incredibly, despite the fact that it is in full view of an adjacent retirement village and a nearby school, nobody sees a thing. The elderly lady with her walking stick and shoes placed alongside her body is found by schoolgirl Java Wilson on her way home from the local shop. From a distance, what looks like a pile of rags attracts her childish curiosity, but what she stumbles across remains an image she will never forget.
And as I walked closer, I saw it was a woman lying on the ground, so I stepped around her. I ran inside, up the stairs to my apartment to get my mum. It was dark blood right in the back of her head, and she had a pool of like a halo around her head of, I don't know, around this big from her actual face. And she was face down. And Mum even said to me, she's breathing, not good, she's breathing, shallow, go and get the doctor.
She too is thought to have been the victim of a heavy fall and is placed in an ambulance where she's pronounced dead by local doctors. Good-meaning neighbours yet again wash down the crime scene, removing any potential forensic evidence, yet another blow for investigators.
The previous two events, the two murders and the attempted murder, were at Mossman, within 1 kilometre of one another. And now we're faced with a similar type murder that's now at Lane Cove, which is several kilometres away. The other problem we had is the copycat syndrome, which unfortunately the media got onto this issue fairly quickly and publicised the fact that it was a copycat killing.
A post-mortem reveals that death is due to massive head injuries, but forensic experts can't identify the weapon.
The body count of elderly women is now 3 dead and 1 survivor in just 7 months, all bludgeoned and bashed in broad daylight, all degraded in some perverted way, and all having had small amounts of money stolen. The next day, the tabloids give the killer a name.
All these ladies, being over 80 years of age, were obviously looked upon as being grandmothers. And so this title evolved of the Granny Killer. And that title seemed to stay with our investigation right through.
It's Friday, November 3rd, and Commissioner Avery calls Inspector Hagan in to quiz him about the murders. The pressure from the top has been turned up.
And the big question was, if there's going to be another murder, where? And how far do we extend the parameters of our investigations now? I mean, it was of great concern. And from our original criminal profile was that we were still looking at a young person.
In the absence of fingerprints, police believe the killer may be wearing gloves. As for the murder weapon, experts still have no clear theory as to what it might be.
In none of these cases were we able to provide anything but the very broadest impression of what the weapon was. The weapon was a blunt object, it had some weight, probably not an overwhelming amount of weight, so in other words it wouldn't weigh 10 kilograms or so, possibly weighed a number of kilograms, but we just couldn't say more than that. And it really frustrated us.
Police set up an operations room at Lane Cove. For many officers, sleep is not an option, as detectives work throughout Thursday night and well into Friday.
Towards the lateness of Friday afternoon, I decided that it was time I went home. I was getting tired. And so we left instructions there, and we had deputy commanders and other people to carry on. So I headed home. And I was just about home late Friday afternoon, within a kilometre of my home, when my beeper went off, and it was the office. And the call was, "Boss, you better turn your car around and come back to work." And they said, "You're not going to believe this, but we've got another murder."
We had worked basically 2 days without a break, and I'd actually taken the top off a can of beer before I was to return home when the phone rang, and it was news that there had been another victim, and this time at a retirement village at Belrose.
This retirement village is nestled in a leafy area of Belrose, also north of Mossman.
It's mid-afternoon, and 81-year-old Olive Cleveland sits on a bench, enjoying the distant ocean views. She's joined by an unwelcome stranger. She moves towards the dining room, but the stranger takes her by the arm and leads her down a nearby ramp.
Isolated and out of sight, he smashes her skull with a blunt weapon. He pulls up her dress and, using her pantyhose, strangles her so tightly that the material is embedded in her neck. He goes through her handbag and methodically places it beside her, along with her shoes and walking stick.
When she's found by staff, the body is placed in a small in-house mortuary. Initially, it's believed that the trauma to her head is due to a heavy fall, but reality bites, and the police are called.
They arrive to find another crime scene has been washed down. The news devastates homicide investigators.
These horrendous murders were taking place, and nobody saw the offender. And that was the bone of contention with the investigators. What are we missing? Why aren't any of these matters being seen by the community? Somebody must have seen something. So whoever was committing them was fitting in to that community.
Dr. Rod Milton sees a distinct pattern emerging.
The use of the pantyhose to strangle them seemed to me to unite his need to humiliate the victim sexually with his need to express violence, because again the violence used was excessive and seemed to say much more about the offender than that he was merely seeking to kill people. It seemed to say that there was this peculiar mixture of sexuality and a need to humiliate. Generally the people who are neatest in our community are those whose training obliges them to be neat, and that means they're people who've had some sort of military training. And of course the victims, as we all know, were all elderly, which suggested something about the offender's relationship with women in his own life.
The skateboard riding suspect, seen in the vicinity of the earlier attacks, complements Milton's theory that the killer may be a person in their 20s, with perhaps a deep hatred of their own grandmother. 4 shocking murders, all committed in daylight hours with no witnesses and no forensic evidence. Sydney's affluent North Shore seems to be at the mercy of an out-of-control madman.
And there was enormous trepidation and fear in the community that this person could continue to carry out these horrendous acts while the police seemed powerless to do anything about it. People were afraid to go out. People were afraid to open their door. Police were going to houses, knocking on the door and the canvas to get information, and people would not open the door to police and saying, how do I know that you're not a police officer? How do I know that you're not dressed up as a police officer?
Saturday, the day after Olive Cleveland's murder, and the North Shore Task Force is officially established. Inspector Hagan's put in charge and handpicks his expanded team to work around the clock.
So from then on, we increased our numbers to a combined task force of about 70 personnel, including homicide investigators, district detectives, intelligence officers, analysts, computer experts, forensic examiners, and that gave us a total of about 70 personnel.
Despite the increased resources, police have surprisingly little information and enlist the help of broadcaster John Laws, who makes this dramatic appeal.
Did you see Lady Ashton that afternoon? Do you remember the lady with the red nylon raincoat and a walking stick? Did you see her being followed? To date, 4 defenceless elderly women have been brutally murdered.
Following this appeal, the state government ups the ante.
In response to a request from Police Commissioner Avery, the state government has doubled the reward, with $200,000 now offered for information leading to the killer or killers of the 4 elderly women on Sydney's North Shore.
As well as investigating a series of murders, police hold community meetings to instruct elderly citizens on personal security.
The task force works relentlessly, some investigators up to 20 hours a day. Undercover cops pose as gardeners and workers at retirement villages. No stone is left unturned in the painstaking search for the killer.
One of the characteristics of a serial killer is that they're very charismatic. They have an ability to be friendly with their victim prior to killing the victim.
The task force officers are being bombarded with tips from the public. All are checked and virtually all are discounted. The very next day, a jogger finds Mrs. Pard's stolen purse near a drain here at the Lane Cove golf course, where a week earlier it had been thrown by the granny killer.
Police know that if the assailant isn't caught soon, he'll strike again. It's a heavy burden for the investigators, and the burden is about to increase to an almost intolerable level.
Muriel Beryl Falconer is sharp-minded for a 93-year-old and reasonably independent. After all, the elderly widow's been living alone in her large Federation-style house in Muston Street, Mossman, for the past 39 years. Her caring neighbours always look out for her, especially Maggie Hughes, who's voiced her concerns about the granny killer on several occasions.
Oh yes, I talked to her at length about it because she would never lock her back door. And I'd go up the back door and I'd go in and I'd say, Mrs. Faulkner, someone will come in here one day and bop you off. And she'd say, they only want my money. And I'll tell them where it is.
However, despite Lady Ashton's death and the more recent murders at Lane Cove and Belrose, Mrs. Falconer is a little more nervous. But despite her safety concerns, on Thursday the 23rd of November, she heads for the local shops.
It's just before 5 p.m. as she strolls home with her shopping. There's no hint of immediate danger as a pair of angry eyes glare at her from across the road. With hatred welling up, the killer walks briskly to his car, parked around the corner, opposite the Mossman police station. He takes something from under the driver's seat and shoves it down the front of his trousers. time is running out for the stalker to strike because the sanctuary of home looms for Mrs. Falconer. He is full of rage and fast catching up. Mrs. Falconer finally reaches her front door, but sadly, it's too late.
The following morning, neighbours become concerned that Mrs. Falconer has left her Meals on Wheels lunch uncollected at the front door. Neighbour Maggie Hughes decides to check on her friend and enters Mrs. Falconer's house using a spare key she'd been given.
And I opened the main door and I noticed the ice cream, a full ice cream container on the floor, and a little purse was on the table there, and the money was all spilt out. And I nearly fell over. And all of a sudden I saw her body in front of me. And then I saw the shoes neatly by the side, and then I noticed that there was blood coming from the head, the back of the head, because she was sprawled out on face down. And I could see all the dried blood. And also, being a trained nurse, the odour, I knew that she had just recently died. But as soon as I saw the shoes, the clothes pulled up, and I could see the pantyhose around the neck, I then was very suspicious that it was a granny killer. In fact, I don't think I was suspicious, I think I knew.
What happened was that he hit her once, she went down. She attempted to get up a second time, and he'd positioned himself in another position, and he hit her again. And then when he was removing her pantyhose and her clothing, she made noises. So he stopped what he was doing and he struck her again.
The injuries sustained by Mrs. Falconer were very severe. There were multiple blunt force head injuries. They were rather dramatic in extent. And she'd also been strangled with her pantyhose. We had no doubt that this was another case of this series of murders.
Maggie amazingly maintains her composure, giving no thought to the fact that the killer could still be lurking inside.
And it was while I was waiting, that's when I noticed a shoe mark. And I put my own foot next to it. And I remember thinking he can't be a very tall man because it was quite a broad foot and not a very long foot mark.
The killer had, obviously unintentionally, trod in the victim's blood. And so we had a footprint in blood in the carpet. Not only one footprint in blood, but we were able to follow a pattern of footprints through the house.
For the first time in the entire investigation, detectives have a pristine crime scene. The forensic investigators cut out the section of carpet containing the bloodied footprint to determine the type of shoe worn by the killer. The media is quickly on the scene, but Detective Inspector Hagan believes that this important piece of forensic evidence should be kept confidential. He doesn't want the killer to know about it in case he disposes of the shoes. The footprint suggests the type of shoe worn by an older person. Maggie Hughes is sworn to secrecy.
We needed a bit of a camouflage to cover what we were doing. And it was suggested that beside this home there was a building site at the moment. There was a lot of workmen there, and there was a lot of footprints in the ground. So anyway, we allowed the scientific police to take some plaster casts of some footprints in the mud in an adjoining premises. So it became quite public that the police had found footprints in the mud or in the dirt beside this house where the murder had been. And it became headlines.
That night, the killer's at home watching the story on the 6 o'clock news. He smiles as he watches vision of police taking plaster cast moulds of a shoe print next door to Mrs. Falconer's home, knowing full well it isn't his. He's outsmarted them again, or so he thinks. The killer's mind is racing. He'll make sure there's nothing to link him to the vicious slayings. He goes to the small shed in his backyard, puts on a pair of thick rubber gloves, takes a bottle of hydrochloric acid from the shelf, picks up the murder weapon and pours the acid onto it. The acid dissolves the bloodstains and the discarded liquid runs into a bucket. Now he feels completely secure. A canvass of the area is conducted, and again it's fruitless. Maybe the killer is so nondescript that he just blends in with the community, a community now living in terror. A rush of information following the Falconer murder boosts the suspect list to 740. One by one they're discounted, until one suspect remains, a 22-year-old unemployed pensioner with a history of psychiatric problems and a hatred for his mother. He is put under 24-hour surveillance. At the same time, Detective Sergeant Paul Tuxford, an old-fashioned investigator with an analytical mind, is reviewing all of the police running sheets for any angle or lead that might have been overlooked. Tuxford decides something's missing, so he returns to speak to Maggie Hughes again. She tells him something previously unreported, that she had seen a portly, grey-haired, middle-aged man wearing a silver-coloured suit in the area on the afternoon of the murder.
My eyes opened up and I said, well, why didn't you mention this before? And she said, oh, I thought I did. And we thought to ourselves, going back to the station, how convenient it would be for the killer to be an elderly man going to old women's houses, getting their confidence and then assaulting them and killing them. And he would fit straight into the picture of the Mossman area.
Sergeant Tuxford asks the task force computer expert to enter the words grey hair and man against all the crime reports on the lower North Shore for the previous 6 months. And then, bingo.
A couple of minutes later, the reports started coming out. There were 6 initially, and I started reading them. And as I was starting reading them, I was getting more and more excited because I could see that this man had assaulted women of about the same age group as Falconer and the rest of the murdered women, knocking them over and stealing money from them.
Sergeant Tuxford is certain that the grey-haired man is the killer, and he finds it difficult to sleep before the next morning's briefing.
I was excited. I was dreaming about it and thinking about it all the time, trying to whip everyone up to say, look, this is what I've got, this is where we're going to, I'm 100% sure about this. And when Dennis came through the door the next day, as I said, Dennis, I've got your man for you, but I just don't know who it is at the moment, but we'll find that out later on.
Included in the information gleaned from the computer search is an assault by a grey-haired man on 84-year-old Margaret Todhunter in Mossman a year earlier. She's since moved to Queensland, and when Tuxford finally interviews her, she's able to provide an accurate description for an identikit drawing. There's more. In July of that year, an elderly lady at the Carolyn Chisholm nursing home in Lane Cove reports that a man had put his hand up her dress as she lay on her bed. Therapist Stephanie Holden knows that her patient hasn't imagined it either.
Another lady yelled out, who could hear my voice. I went in to see her, and she was very excited that someone had touched her buttocks. And I thought she was having me on. I said so, and she said, oh, no, he did. And I said, well, what was he wearing? And she said he had white hair and he was wearing a brown leather jacket.
Another computer entry also gives detail of a similar assault in similar circumstances several months earlier. All these incidents have been reported to local police, but at the time they're considered to be unrelated events. As a result, the information has not been directly passed on to the task force. This latest data, however, seems to substantiate Sergeant Tuxford's grey-haired man theory. The North Shore Murders Task Force has been operating for 3 weeks and is frustrated further when the killer strikes again, virtually under the very nose of the investigation team. The slaying of Mrs. Falconer is the most vicious of them all. However, the crime scene is the most revealing yet. Christmas 1989 comes and goes. The government has boosted the reward to $250,000. The deranged 22-year-old Mossman resident remains the prime suspect and under constant surveillance. But a grey-haired man is about to become a more prominent feature of the police probe. January the 11th, 1990, at Greenwich Hospital, an elderly patient, Daisy Roberts, calls a nurse for assistance.
and said, oh, look, the doctor's been in and he's put his hand under my nightie and said, oh, you're losing your body heat, and he's gone. And the nurse said, no, that's not right, because the doctor hasn't been in today at all. And it could have been left at that.
Fortunately, it wasn't. The sister, Pauline Davis, telephones Chatswood detectives to complain of an indecent assault. A young constable is sent to the hospital to investigate. A list of those who visited the hospital includes a grey-haired pie salesman named John Wayne Glover. But it's a local inquiry and not tied to the Granny murders. It's now 10 p.m. and considered too late by the officer to contact Glover at his Mossman home. She elects to continue the inquiry the next day.
That person turned out to be a representative of a meat pie company who declined to say anything to them and wished to get legal advice. However, did agree to meet with police the following day with a solicitor to discuss this matter, to be interviewed. The following day, that person did not turn up for the appointed interview, and the police contacted his home to be told by his wife that he had attempted suicide. And as a direct result of these outlandish allegations by the police.
A distraught Gay Glover tells police that her husband has been rushed to the Royal North Shore Hospital. He's taken a number of sleeping pills and washed them down with whiskey.
At this stage, Glover is considered to be only a person of interest in what is thought to be a case of common assault. The young officer and her partner arrive here at the hospital, where a doctor hands them a copy of a suicide note. That will later prove to be crucial. They try to talk to Glover, but again he refuses.
So what they did was they made some inquiries there, and they asked him if he wouldn't mind being subject to a Polaroid photograph, if they could take a Polaroid photograph of him to see if that would help match who it was that was wandering around the ward on this particular day. And he volunteered this Polaroid photograph. So they actually took a Polaroid photograph of John Glover.
One of the detectives takes the Polaroid picture to Sister Davis at the Greenwich Hospital. She identifies him as the same man she'd confronted. So too does the elderly victim. More questioning is required. Unfortunately, the Polaroid photograph and suicide note are filed away when the investigating detective is required to complete a 2-week training course. In the meantime, Gay Glover, believing her husband's denials and fearing police mistakenly have accused him, commissions the services of lawyer Don Wakeling.
On the one hand, incensed that the allegation was made against him and felt it was a total smirch on his character. And secondly, that he had seen it as, the allegation that is, as a sort of straw that broke his back, bearing in mind certain other life difficulties he was having. And he said that that's what drove him to attempt to take his life. But he certainly denied the allegation at that time.
It would be a couple of weeks before the young officer who took the Polaroid photo realises the significance of her inquiry and that it may just be of interest to the North Shore Murders Task Force.
When we were presented with the Polaroid photograph of this person who was involved in an alleged indecent assault at the hospital, with the sketch, the police sketch made by the police artist in Queensland, the similarities jumped out at us, and I think as one, we all looked at each other and this is the same person. Whether it's our boy is another thing, but he's certainly looking good.
The suicide note is quite interesting. It's a piece of paper that he'd obviously got from work, but there was a lot of writing on this note, and it was rambling writing because he was under the effects of the whiskey that he'd drunk. But right in the middle of that was words to the effect, "No more grannies," which was quite interesting and quite pertinent. No more grannies.
The task force has now been handed its first real break in a frustratingly long and exhaustive investigation. None of the team has previously encountered anything of such enormity. And for Sergeant Tuxford, the originator of the grey-haired man theory, vindication looks increasingly more likely.
As soon as I saw that pen ring, I knew I was looking at the North Shore murderer. Even though that we couldn't prove it was, I personally knew it was. I had this gut feeling, as I said before, and I knew that in the end we'd get him.
Almost 12 months since the murder of Mrs. Mitchell Hill, and police now have a new prime suspect, a grey-haired man who appears to fit the bill. He's been accused of sexually assaulting elderly women. He attempts suicide, leaving a note that says, "No more grannies," and he's a Mossman resident. Detectives again examine the Glover suicide note for further clues. Besides "no more grannies," there are phrases such as "sell up" and "piss off," believed to be advice to his family. "Gay, don't try to understand, Essie started it," an explanation for his wife, Gay, regarding Glover's relationship with her mother, Essie. They also discover that Glover has become impotent, which detectives speculate could have led to the sexually degrading poses of the victims.
In my own mind, I believed that this was our man. I've got to say that. And I know that other members of the team felt the same way. But you can't let that override your judgment or your thinking, and we had to prevent tunnel vision. We had to keep an open mind on the whole thing, but in my mind, this was the man we were after, yes.
Glover is placed under 24-hour surveillance in the hope that he'll somehow reveal himself to be the granny killer. His car is covertly fitted with a tracking device after Glover suspects police may be onto him.
And he was employing anti-surveillance techniques. We were aware of that through the device placed in his car, and that allowed the teams to not have visual contact with him. For example, he was driving around the block 2 or 3 times. He was driving the wrong way up one-way streets in an attempt to see if anybody was following him.
The surveillance also reveals that Glover is a regular at the Mossman RSL Club in the heart of granny killer territory, generally arriving around mid to late afternoon and departing before 6 p.m. A background check reveals that Glover has form. He'd been convicted of 2 counts of indecently assaulting women, 2 counts of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and 5 counts of larceny, all committed when he lived in Melbourne from 1957 to 1965.
Armed with a photo of Glover, a team of investigators begins canvassing every nursing home and retirement village on Sydney's lower North Shore to determine if anyone has seen this man acting inappropriately. At several of the nursing homes, Glover is identified as having indecently assaulted elderly patients after visiting these premises in his role as a pie salesman. Detective Kim Mackay goes alone to the James Milson nursing home at Kirribilli, one of the last on the list. She questions the staff, but what the secretary has to say stuns her.
She said, you know, does this person work for pies? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, he does. And I thought that's really good evidence because she's got clear memory and an identity of who this person is. And then she said to him, is his name John Glover? I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I don't have to rely on physical identification. This woman actually knows who he is. I said, well, yes, it's John Glover. And she just looked me in the eye and she said, that's my husband. And I just couldn't comprehend the coincidence of the fact that here I was with 3 million people in Sydney, and there I was talking to the main suspect's wife. And at that stage I was just incredulous.
There's now a real fear among investigators that Gay will tell her husband of the police inquiry about him, and that fear was justified. She did tell him, but believed his strenuous denials. It's Monday morning on the 19th of March 1990, 4 days after this chance meeting with Gay Glover, and 6 weeks into the surveillance of her husband, John Glover.
On this particular occasion, Glover was followed from his house. He made a telephone call to his work, and he told his work that he was going to meet with his legal representative to discuss this scurrilous allegation that the police had made to him about the incident at the nursing home. And he was taking the day off. He was followed to a bottle shop and he was seen to purchase a bottle of scotch. He then drove to an address in Beauty Point where he removed his tie, but he did his hair and he placed the bottle of scotch in a briefcase. This was under the observation of the police. The police were in the very near vicinity. He was then seen to leave his car, lock his car, and he walked up to a house in Beauty Point. He entered the front yard and the front door to that house was opened to him by a woman who obviously knew him, and he entered the house.
Police take up positions around the entire house. There's nothing to suggest anything untoward. As the day wears on, back at Task Force headquarters, Sergeant O'Toole is becoming anxious with the information being relayed from the surveillance team. Glover is still inside the house, and there's been no movement for some hours. Police learn that the house in Pindari Avenue belongs to 60-year-old divorcee Joan Sinclair, a close friend of Glover's.
A team, including myself, went out to Mossman and sat in the near vicinity, off the place, to monitor the situation. In the afternoon, following school, there were two young children seen to go up to the door to the house, knock on the door. There was no reply. They left the house. They went to a neighbour, and at that stage we began to get a little bit concerned about what was going on in the house.
The anxiety level is becoming almost unbearable. Glover has been inside Joan Sinclair's home for about 8 hours, and there is still no sign of life. Mrs. Sinclair owns a couple of dogs that are constantly barking. That provides O'Toole with an excuse to send uniformed police around to ostensibly deal with a noise complaint without jeopardising the surveillance operation. When there's no answer at the front door, the uniformed police go to the back of the house.
They had actually entered the house where they saw a hammer on the floor and they saw what appeared to be a body in a hallway. They then retreated out the back of the premises, and that was upon our arrival.
4 task force detectives, Dennis O'Toole, Paul Mager, Murray Burns and Paul Jacob arrive. They're quickly briefed and take up their positions, guns drawn, as darkness falls.
The 4 of us entered and fanned out from the rear door of the premises into the house. I saw the hammer on the floor and went to the hallway where I saw the body of a woman. I turned the light on then, and whilst the other 3 detectives basically covered me, and I felt for any signs of life with the woman. She was cold at that point of time and was obviously deceased.
During the course of that, we saw the male person's clothing. I think it was a pair of trousers and a white shirt in the main bedroom of the house. Again, that heightened our belief that Glover was in the house at some point. We continued that search, again being absolutely careful. Each room we cleared until we came to the bathroom. Paul Mager slowly opened the bathroom door, and through the crack we could see the body of John Glover in the bath. And I immediately called to Dennis O'Toole. We've got him.
His nose was just clear of the water. I saw that. He'd vomited in the bath, but he was still breathing. We checked him and he was still breathing. And at that stage, I directed the fellows to call for assistance, 000, for an ambulance, for a drug overdose, urgent drug overdose, and contacted Detective Superintendent Mike Hagan, in charge of the task force, and informed him that we had our suspect. He was alive, but we certainly had another deceased woman, which was something I'll never forget, and certainly had mixed feelings. I have no idea to describe to this day how I felt at that particular time, other than probably something of great anger.
We were totally devastated and disappointed that that happened. But it was totally out of our control. It was unpredicted, and there was nothing really that we could have done to prevent that.
I was repulsed by this person, revulsion. There were a number of feelings going through my mind at the time. But overriding all of those personal feelings was the feeling that he had to be saved. We had to save this person. And I just ensured that he was still breathing and held his head back at the top of the bath. I held his hair until the ambulance arrived, and they pulled him from the bath, wrapped him in a thermo blanket, and he was basically immediately conveyed to the Royal North Shore Hospital, under police escort, of course.
In the bathroom, there's evidence of the lethal cocktail of pills and alcohol he'd consumed, and a broken glass he used in an effort to slit his wrists.
And no doubt the combination of all that ingestion made him sick, and vomited up the contents of his stomach and quite possibly saved his life.
Investigations reveal that Glover had arranged to take Joan Sinclair, his companion of 18 months, to lunch, and that's why he was so warmly welcomed on arrival.
Mrs. Sinclair had been murdered in a very similar way to all the other people. She'd sustained severe head injuries caused by a blunt object. She'd been strangled with pantyhose. Lying near the body was a hammer. To find out that after all these deaths, that in fact the injuries had been caused by a hammer, really did surprise. The problem, of course, with all these murders was that the hammer was covered with toweling or other fabric, and this dramatically changed the bloodstain patterns. Not only that, but of course in the majority of cases, the death scenes were washed clean. So you landed up not being able to tell anything at the death scenes.
The media is soon on the scene as the buzz becomes a roar that the granny killer has been caught. The police and the public heave a big sigh of relief, and for many, disbelief.
Disbelief that it was somebody who lived in the community for a long time and had presented as an ordinary family man, wife, children, job, all those sorts of things. Apparently an ordinary member of the community, but clearly not so.
But detectives still have a lot of work to do before they can close the case. They still have to interview Glover and tie up a lot of loose ends. Detectives Murray Burns and Paul Jacob are assigned to accompany Glover to the hospital. In the early hours of the morning, he regains consciousness and starts talking.
It started out simply as small talk, and I remember him talking about his family and how this would affect his family, and Murray indicating that he should concern himself with his position and worry about that issue of the family later. It was at that point he talked about the similarities that these women had to his mother-in-law, and in effect was accepting responsibility for causing their deaths in a roundabout way. Enough for us to make notes of the conversation and call Dennis O'Toole and Paul Mager sort of immediately.
Detective Sergeant O'Toole and Mager rush to the hospital, where they also speak to Glover.
He admitted to the crimes straight away. It certainly took us by surprise. I gave him an official caution, which I'm required to do in any of these matters, and asked him who was responsible for the death of Joan Sinclair. And his reply was, I was. I then questioned him in relation to other matters. They were all the outstanding murders, and he admitted being the person responsible. That conversation was recorded in a police notebook by Detective Mager, and Glover signed in each instance as to the authenticity of that admission.
Police telephone Gay Glover to tell her of her husband's condition and the likelihood that charges will be laid. Solicitor Don Wakeling rushes to the hospital to represent Glover.
Glover made it clear to me that he himself wanted to make a statement as to those murders, and was very clear and persistent in his wish to make the statement. Without using his exact words, which I can't certainly recall now, he made it clear that he wanted to get it off his chest.
Well, the extraordinary thing from my point of view so far as his interviews go was the absolute matter-of-fact way in which he would describe in detail these vicious crimes. He would talk about them as if he was talking about making a cup of tea, the processes of making a cup of tea. It was absolutely extraordinary.
John Glover's family is shattered to learn that their husband and father is the granny killer. It's here at his Mossman home that police find a pair of shoes, one that fits the bloody shoe print left by the killer of 93-year-old Mrs. Falconer. Investigators now have the first piece of physical evidence to definitely tie Glover to the murder of one of the women.
Later that night, a bedside court is convened here at the hospital, and Glover is formally charged with one count of murder, that of Mrs. Joan Sinclair. He's remanded in custody. However, authorities still have one major hurdle to overcome.
He's admitted to the murders, but there is still much for police and prosecutors to do. They must ensure that any possible claims of temporary insanity are completely rebuffed. Task Force detectives return to the murder scenes with Glover, and there he freely describes in gory detail how he stalked and killed his victims.
He would commit the murder and then invariably go to a local club where he would spend the money that he had just removed from the purses of the victims. And there's no doubt at all that he got a great deal of satisfaction in not only putting that money into poker machines, but to go and buy other people, and in particular elderly women, friends of his, drinks. I think it's fair to say that he got a great deal of satisfaction out of watching the media reports and reading the media reports after each of these murders. And it's something that the family, his own family, find very, very hard to come to grips with, where he would joke about the murders and say about this madman being out there and how the police couldn't catch him and the police were idiots and the police had no idea who he was. And that's had a very, very severe impact on his family.
Police also delve into Glover's background to find out what motivated his lust for murdering old women. They discovered Glover came from a working-class family in Wolverhampton, and his mother Frida had several husbands and many boyfriends. She lived a very loose moral life. Glover had a petty criminal history with a string of convictions for thefts. He was in the army briefly, but was thrown out when his criminal history was discovered. In 1957, Glover migrated to Australia, living in Melbourne, where he was convicted of several indecent assaults. In 1968, Glover met and married Gay Rolls before moving with her to Sydney, where the couple lived in a Mossman home owned by Gay's parents, Essie and Jack. Glover was marrying above his station, and he knew full well that Gay's mother, Essie, didn't like him. When the Glovers moved into her Mossman house, the bitter feelings between Essie and Glover intensified. On March 28, 1990, John Wayne Glover, 57, salesman of Mossman, appears under heavy guard at Glebe Coroner's Court, where he's formally charged with 6 murders and a string of assaults. Although he's already admitted to the crimes, Glover is pleading not guilty. His defence, temporary insanity.
We defended Glover's case on the basis of what's called diminished responsibility. And that is that though he plainly admitted what he did, the question then is whether what he did amounts to murder or manslaughter.
The person chosen to handle this high-profile case is experienced Crown Prosecutor Wendy Robinson QC, someone who's prosecuted many prominent crimes, but nothing of this magnitude.
The main pressure was that many people had remarked to me, including people who I thought were sufficiently educated to perhaps know a little better, that if you go out and hit little old ladies over the head with hammers, which is how these were generally characterised in the public, that you must be mad. And so that sense that people, even jurors who were presented close up with the detail, would think, well, if you go around doing this, you must be mad. There must be something mentally deficient about you, and that would translate into a diminished responsibility defence, was a very great concern.
November 18th, 1991, and the trial begins. The defence puts up two psychiatric experts who give evidence that they believe a deep-seated hatred of his mother and mother-in-law drove Glover to commit the murders, and that he was insane at the time. But police give evidence that Glover made meticulous preparations for his 12-month killing spree.
On each occasion, he would carry the hammer in his car. He'd carry out these acts. He'd invariably return home, burn the gardening gloves that he had used in the attack, and he would wash the hammer with hydrochloric acid and hose it down up in the shed, up in the backyard.
He actually hated his mother-in-law and his mother, who at that particular time or prior to that were both over 80 years of age, so they fitted the characteristic of the victims that he was killing. So he had this emotional hatred for his mother-in-law and his own mother, and both of them had died of natural causes within several months prior to him commencing this murder spree. And we think that this was the motivation for him.
It's Dr. Rod Milton's evidence that is crucial in rebuffing Glover's defence of temporary insanity, that Glover was bad, not mad.
By saying, well, how could there be a division between good and bad if this person could be so self-serving as to wash the hammer to remove traces of blood, and at what point did the good person come in? Was the good person the one who washed the hammer, or was it the bad one? And I think by reducing this whole issue to the absurd, I think that probably made it clear to the jury that there really wasn't much in that kind of defence.
And I saw Glover gritting his teeth, going redder in the face, and gripping the edge of the dock with his fingers, and staring down at Dr. Milton as he gave his evidence. That was the only time I saw him show that sort of emotion or anger. I think the doctor was hitting the mark.
Finally, Glover makes a statement from the dock, pleading to the jury that he had shown remorse for his ugly deeds. "I'm sorry. What more can I say?" he tells the jury, as he feigns tears.
And he was, for the most part, almost motionless. I mean, the extraordinary thing about him was that he did maintain, being sort of fairly rotund and white-haired and the age that he was, quite a sort of shambling, slightly grandfatherly, almost benign sort of presence. You know, it was extraordinarily difficult in some ways to relate the violence of the material that we were dealing with to the person who was, 6 or 8 feet away, in that dock.
The jury only deliberates for a couple of hours before returning to a packed and hushed courtroom for the verdict. Glover stands at attention before Justice Wood as the foreman declares him guilty on each of the charges. His defence of diminished responsibility has been totally rejected, and John Wayne Glover, father, husband and granny killer, is convicted and sentenced to jail for the term of his natural life.
He gasped And I don't think that his reaction was one of amazement that he wasn't found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. I don't think it was that. I think he was just suddenly realised that here he is. He's been found to be a murderer of such magnitude.
So the case of the North Shore serial killings is now complete. John Wayne Glover has been put away, never to see freedom again. He'll die behind bars, knowing he'll always be known as the Granny Killer. For members of the task force, it's still far from over, as they struggle to recover from the emotional trauma. But despite the apparent closure of the Granny Killer's reign of terror, police remain convinced that John Wayne Glover has killed before. Dennis O'Toole is one of the few people with whom Glover still talks. On his numerous visits to Lithgow Jail, O'Toole often quizzes Glover about the unsolved murders.
Now, in each of those matters, Glover has been interviewed. However, he has denied any involvement in any murder outside the Granny murders, if I could use that term. Despite his denials, we are firmly of the opinion that he is responsible for other outstanding matters. And I'm under no illusion that he plays mind games with me. We have spoken on many occasions. What value is there, I really don't know, because I'm aware of that mind game, but at least he's talking to me. But I think that John likes to be in control at all times.
The file remains open on the murders of 7 elderly women. There are 4 in Melbourne between 1961 and 1968. Glover lived in Melbourne at the time and in the near vicinity of the murders of Elsie Boys, 63, Emmy May Anderson, 78, Irene Kiddle, 61, and Christina Yankos, 63. Glover is also strongly suspected of killing Florence Broadhurst, aged 78. She was found bashed to death in her home decor showroom at Paddington, Sydney, on October the 16th, 1977. Glover knew Miss Broadhurst, a noted Sydney home decorator, and had visited her several times. Police believe he also committed 2 murders on the New South Wales Central Coast in the mid-80s, the same time that Glover visited his mother, who'd migrated and lived there. The victims were Josephine MacDonald, aged 72, and 83-year-old Wanda Amundsen. All these women died in similar circumstances to those on Sydney's lower North Shore, and all of these cases remain open. With the Granny Killer now behind bars, this should have been the end of the story. But John Wayne Glover still has one more card to play. On Friday, the 9th of September 2005, John Glover commits suicide, hanging himself in Lithgow Jail. Police suspect that Glover may be responsible for 7 other murders. Has the Granny Killer taken his secrets with him to the grave? Dennis O'Toole is the last person from outside to see him alive.
It was at that time that I reminded John that we'd made a pact some years ago where he had volunteered to me that when he felt that he was due to meet his maker, and they were his words, not mine, that maybe those dark secrets in his mind would unlock. And he said at that time, he said, I'll call you and I want you to come running. And it was obviously a reference to outstanding matters that I'd questioned him over the years about. I reminded him of that, and his reply to me was, very matter-of-factly, which murders? Which ones? And I said, John, I want you to tell me. I'm not telling you, you tell me. And with that, he looked at me for a few seconds, and then he just changed the subject. Just prior to leaving John on that occasion, he did hand me something. It was a sketch, a pencil sketch that he had made, and I declined it initially, but he enforced it on me and said he wanted me to take it. and asked me was I aware of the pine trees out the front of Medlow Bath. I got a little bit of a rise, I suppose, in my blood pressure when I had a look at the sketch. And looking at the pine trees in particular, there are some things there I can't make out, but one letter or one numeral that stands out in the pine trees appears to be the numeral 9. It's quite obvious and apparent in that sketch what that 9 represents is open to conjecture.
It's a shock, absolute shock. I didn't expect it. I knew that Glover had been unwell, fairly seriously unwell, but I never expected him to be dead so quickly. And I never expected him to die in these circumstances so quickly. So it's quite sudden, really, from my point of view. And I can only presume that the things that have happened in recent weeks has impacted upon his mind. He's been thinking about it.
This would be the last time that I'd see him that I wouldn't call out there again. And I questioned him to that, as to why he would say that. And he replied that he was getting old. He was getting very old. I said, John, we're all getting old. And I said, you're not having silly thoughts, are you? He gave a bit of a laugh and shook his head. I said, John, you'll be around for a while. The devil looks after his own. John just gave a laugh, turned round and walked out of the room.
Although Glover is now dead, many questions still remain unanswered, and the full extent of the Granny killer's murderous activities may never be known. For the families who've been left to pick up the pieces following John Wayne Glover's reign of terror, their nightmare will never be over.